The summer sun had just begun to climb higher into the pale blue sky, and the neighborhood was quiet except for the faint hum of lawnmowers in the distance. Birds sang from the trees lining the quiet cul-de-sac, their chirps carrying on the gentle breeze. Lisa Thompson, a woman who had always found peace in the small rituals of suburban life, stood on her porch with a watering can in hand, tending to the flowers she had planted months earlier. The pink and purple blooms brought her a kind of comfort she needed after the long years her husband, Marcus, had spent away on deployment. She bent down to adjust a pot, humming softly to herself, unaware that her morning was about to turn into something far darker than she could have ever imagined. The tranquility shattered when the sound of screeching tires pierced through the calm. Lisa straightened, the watering can still in her hand, her eyes narrowing at the black sedan that skidded to a stop right in front of her driveway. The car door slammed and two men stepped out, moving with an aggressive energy that immediately unsettled her. Their uniforms looked official at first glance, dark blue, badges glinting on their chests, radios clipped to their belts. But something about them seemed off. The patches on their sleeves looked cheap, as if they had been ironed on, and their badges didn't carry the weight or shine of real authority. The taller of the two men adjusted his sunglasses and pointed at her house. "Ma'am, you're in violation of HOA regulations," he barked. His voice was loud, rehearsed, almost theatrical, as if he wanted the entire block to hear. Lisa blinked, confused. "Excuse me? We don't have an HOA here. We've never had one." Her voice carried both confusion and a polite firmness, the kind she used when she was trying not to escalate things. The second man, stockier and with a cruel smirk plastered across his face, stepped closer, his boots crunching against the gravel. "Don't play dumb. Your mailbox, your lawn, your paint color, it's all wrong. The association has filed complaints. You either comply or face fines. We're here to enforce the rules." Lisa's heart skipped. The words didn't make sense. There had been rumors of a group in the area pretending to be part of some HOA, harassing families and threatening them with fines, but she had always dismissed them as neighborhood gossip. Now, standing in her own driveway, she realized those rumors weren't just stories. Trying to steady her voice, Lisa set down her watering can. "I think you've got the wrong house, and if you're with the city or law enforcement, I'd like to see some proper identification." The taller man sneered. "Lady, don't test us. We don't need to show you anything." Lisa's pulse quickened. She could feel something was wrong, something deeply dangerous. She took a step back toward the porch. "I'm calling my husband," she said, her hand inching toward the phone in her pocket. That was when it happened. The stocky man suddenly lunged forward, closing the gap between them in 2 strides. Before she could react, he shoved her shoulder hard, the force making her stumble against the porch railing. "Don't walk away when we're talking to you," he shouted, his spit flying across her face. Lisa gasped, fear flooding her chest, but before she could cry out for help, the man's hand swung across her face. The crack of the slap echoed like a gunshot in the still air, sending her head snapping to the side. Pain flared across her cheek, hot and sharp, and she clutched it instinctively, eyes wide with shock. The neighbor's curtains twitched. Someone gasped from across the street, but no one moved. Everyone knew this group had been terrorizing the area, and most people were too afraid to get involved. Lisa staggered, her vision blurring as tears welled in her eyes, not just from the sting, but from the humiliation, the rage, the violation. Her heart pounded against her rib cage, and she felt a scream caught in her throat. But before she could utter a word, the front door behind her creaked open. Inside the house, Marcus Thompson had heard it all. The screech of tires, the raised voices, the sudden thud against the porch, and then, most unmistakably, the sound of his wife being struck. He froze in the middle of the living room, every nerve in his body tightening like a coiled spring. For Marcus, sound was everything. Years of Navy SEAL training had sharpened his instincts to the point where he could distinguish the difference between a falling pan and a gunshot in an instant, and he knew without a shadow of a doubt what that slap meant. Marcus wasn't just a husband. He wasn't just a man in his 40s enjoying the quiet after years of service. He was a weapon, forged in the heat of combat, tempered by discipline, sharpened by experience. He had endured deserts, jungles, and hostile territories where hesitation meant death. And now, in the place where he should feel safest, someone had dared to lay hands on his wife. The world outside slowed as Marcus stepped onto the porch. He wasn't charging, wasn't shouting. He didn't need to. His calm, controlled movements radiated something far more terrifying than rage: certainty. His tall frame cast a long shadow that stretched across the driveway, swallowing the two impostors whole. Lisa, clutching her cheek, turned to him with relief and fear mingled in her tearful eyes. "Marcus," she whispered. The stocky man snorted, taking a step back, but his partner barked out a laugh. "And who the hell are you? Stay inside before you get hurt, old man." Marcus's eyes locked on them, cold and unblinking. His voice came low, steady, every syllable like a blade. "You just made the worst mistake of your lives." The impostors exchanged glances and laughed again, mistaking his calmness for weakness. They had seen men puff up their chests before, trying to act tough. To them, Marcus was just another homeowner who would back down once he realized he was outnumbered. But Marcus wasn't posturing. He was calculating. In the space of a single breath, he had already noted their stance, the way they held themselves, the small tells that revealed everything he needed to know. They weren't cops. They weren't even trained fighters. They were bullies in cheap uniforms, relying on fear to get what they wanted. Lisa could feel it. The shift in the air, the tension building like a storm. She whispered again, "Marcus, please." But deep down she knew it was too late. Her husband wasn't going to let this pass. Not after what they had done to her. The taller man puffed his chest. "You gonna hit us, old man? Go ahead, try it. See what happens." Marcus's lips twitched, not into a smile but into something darker, something dangerous. He took another step forward, his boots echoing against the wooden steps of the porch. The sun caught the scars on his forearms, faint but visible, souvenirs of battles fought oceans away. Every part of him screamed danger, though he didn't raise his fists, didn't shout, didn't threaten. The neighborhood held its breath. Curtains parted, faces pressed against glass. Everyone had seen these fake enforcers swagger through the streets before, but no one had seen someone stand up to them. And as Marcus advanced with that eerie, composed silence, something inside the crowd shifted. Hope flickered where fear had long reigned. The stocky man, the one who had struck Lisa, sneered, trying to mask his unease. "Back off before you regret it." Marcus tilted his head slightly, his eyes never leaving the man's face. His voice came quieter this time, almost a whisper, yet somehow it carried through the stillness of the street. "You already made sure I won't." The impostors didn't realize it, but they had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. In the heart of a man who had seen war, who had fought to protect not just strangers but his own, something had been unleashed. It wasn't just anger, it was instinct, purpose, duty. The same resolve that had carried him through missions where survival was unlikely, now burned with a singular focus. Defending his wife, his home, his honor, and the two men who thought they could intimidate a family with fake authority were about to learn a lesson they would never forget. The air between Marcus and the two impostors seemed to thicken, like the charged stillness before a lightning strike. He stood at the bottom of the porch steps now, his presence filling the space in a way that made even the watching neighbors feel their breath catch. Lisa, her cheek throbbing and eyes wide, stayed frozen against the railing, torn between wanting to beg him to stay calm and the primal satisfaction of knowing justice was coming. The taller impostor jabbed his finger toward Marcus, his face twisted in mock authority. "I said stay back, old man. Don't make us cuff you too. You're interfering with an HOA enforcement." His words wavered ever so slightly at the end, though, betrayed by the icy calm staring back at him. Marcus's silence was deliberate. In training, he had learned that silence could be more unsettling than shouting. Enemies had cursed at him, begged him, threatened him, but it was always his stillness that broke them first. Now he let that silence spread, forcing the impostors to squirm in their false bravado. He watched their feet, the way they shifted uneasily. He watched the tremor in their fingers, the sweat forming along their hairlines. Then the stockier man stepped forward, puffing himself up, trying to recover the upper hand. "I said back off," he roared, swinging a fist wildly at Marcus's face. The punch never landed. In a blur of motion, Marcus's hand shot out, intercepting the wrist midair. His grip clamped down like a steel vise, twisting with practiced precision. The man's scream tore through the street as his arm bent in a direction it wasn't meant to go. The sound of bone popping filled the driveway, followed by the heavy thud of the thug crashing to the ground. The scream that followed was raw, piercing, and the neighbors gasped as if the very foundations of their houses trembled from it. Marcus didn't gloat, didn't pause. He moved like water, controlled, efficient, unstoppable. The second imposter reached for the baton at his belt, but Marcus was already in motion. He closed the distance in 2 quick steps, his elbow slamming into the man's jaw with the weight of years of training behind it. The crack of bone meeting bone echoed, followed by the crunch of teeth shattering. Blood sprayed across the hood of Lisa's car as the thug collapsed, his body folding in on itself. The taller man staggered, clutching his face, groaning in agony. Marcus didn't let him fall completely. He grabbed the collar of his uniform shirt and slammed him against the hood of the car with enough force to dent the metal. "You put your hands on my wife," Marcus growled, his voice low and guttural, a sound forged in battlefields far from this quiet street. "Now you answer to me," the imposter gurgled, trying to form words through blood and broken teeth. "Well, we're cops." Marcus's grip tightened, jerking him upright so their faces were inches apart. His eyes, cold and merciless, locked onto the man's. "No, real cops don't hit women. Real cops don't hide behind fake badges. You're nothing but cowards," the man whimpered, his earlier arrogance gone, stripped bare by the reality of pain and the immovable force holding him. From behind, the first thug, the one with the broken wrist, tried to crawl away, dragging himself toward the edge of the driveway. His breaths came out in ragged sobs, sweat and tears mixing with the dust on his face. Marcus released the second man just long enough to stride after him. He grabbed the crawling man by the ankle and dragged him back across the gravel. The stones scraped against skin, leaving trails of blood in their wake. The neighbors watched in wide-eyed horror and awe, some covering their mouths, others filming on their phones. For the first time, the street wasn't ruled by fear, it was electrified with justice. The man kicked weakly, crying out, "Stop! Stop, please!" Marcus yanked him closer, towering over him like a storm cloud ready to unleash hell. "Did she beg you to stop when you hit her?" His voice thundered, not in volume but in weight, each word crushing the air out of the thug's lungs. The man whimpered, shaking his head desperately. Marcus dropped him like trash on the concrete, turning back to the second imposter who was clutching his shattered jaw. He stumbled to his knees, eyes pleading for mercy. But Marcus had no mercy to give. His training had taught him many things: patience, discipline, precision. But it had also taught him that you do not harm the innocent. That line, once crossed, demanded consequences. The neighbors' phones caught every second, the ironclad grip, the broken bones, the undeniable authority radiating from Marcus. These men had swaggered through the community for weeks, harassing and bullying. They had threatened children, shouted at mothers, extorted families. And now they were reduced to sobbing wrecks on one man's driveway. The wail of sirens pierced the air, faint at first but growing louder, closer. Someone had called the police, and the flashing red and blue lights soon reflected against the houses. The imposters' faces lit up with desperate hope, thinking the arrival of real law enforcement would save them. But Marcus didn't flinch, didn't move from his place of dominance. He stood over them as the squad car pulled up, as uniformed officers stepped out with hands on their weapons, uncertain of what scene they were walking into. The taller officer shouted, "Step away from them! Hands where we can see them!" Marcus turned slowly, raising his hands in compliance, his chest heaving but his expression calm, collected as if everything that had happened had been nothing more than another mission completed. "They're not cops," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "They're imposters. Check their uniforms, their badges. All of it is fake." The officers exchanged wary glances, then rushed forward. They checked the badges, tugged at the uniforms, tested the radios. Within minutes, the truth unraveled. The patches were counterfeit, the badges were cheap plastic, the radios nothing more than props. The two men groaned, broken and battered, their charade exposed in the most humiliating way possible. One of the officers looked at Marcus, his eyes flicking from the groaning bodies on the ground to the resolute figure standing over them. "Sir, what exactly did you do to them?" Marcus's gaze shifted briefly to Lisa, who was now being comforted by a neighbor with an ice pack pressed to her swollen cheek. His jaw tightened. Then he turned back to the officer. What needed to be done? The officer didn't argue. He could see the truth etched across the impostors' battered faces, in their trembling limbs and swollen jaws. These weren't men who had stumbled into the wrong neighborhood by accident. They had been predators, and they had finally met someone who refused to be prey. The crowd of neighbors, once too afraid to speak, now found their voices. Some began clapping, tentative at first but growing louder, bolder, until the whole street echoed with applause. Others shouted words of thanks, of admiration, their voices carrying over the sirens and radios. Marcus didn't bask in it. He didn't raise his fists in victory or acknowledge the cheers. He simply walked back to Lisa, gently resting a hand against her back as if shielding her from the world. She leaned into him, her tears flowing freely now, not from pain but from relief. Relief that he had been there, that justice had been served, that she wasn't alone. The officers cuffed the imposters, their broken bodies barely able to resist. One of them muttered through blood and missing teeth, We'll get you for this." Marcus turned his head just enough for his icy eyes to meet theirs one last time. "No," he said, his tone final and unyielding. "You won't." The words hung in the air long after the men were shoved into the back of the police cruiser. The neighborhood, for the first time in months, exhaled. Parents hugged their children. Couples exchanged looks of awe. The fear that had settled like a fog over their homes seemed to dissipate with the fading echo of the sirens. And Marcus stood in the middle of it all, not as a hero in his own eyes, but as a husband who had done what any husband should, protect his wife, his family, his home. To the neighbors, though, he was something more. He was proof that bullies could be stopped, that cowards could be broken, that justice didn't always wear a badge. He turned back to Lisa, brushing a stray tear from her cheek. His touch as gentle as his earlier strikes had been brutal. "No one touches you. Ever," he whispered, the words carrying the weight of a vow that went deeper than any promise he had made before. Lisa nodded, her hand slipping into his, holding tight, knowing that with him, she was safe, truly safe. The flashing lights faded as the police cruisers pulled away, the imposters handcuffed in the back seats, their broken bodies slumped in defeat. The sound of their sirens echoed briefly in the distance before vanishing into the night, leaving behind an eerie stillness on the street. Neighbors lingered on their porches and lawns, speaking in hushed voices as though afraid to disturb the fragile peace that had just been reclaimed. The scent of gasoline and summer flowers still hung in the air, mingling with the metallic tang of blood on the driveway where the two men had fallen. Marcus stood tall at the center of it all, his arm wrapped protectively around Lisa. She leaned into him, still holding the ice pack against her cheek, the swelling visible even in the fading sunlight. For the first time since the chaos had erupted, she allowed herself to breathe deeply. Her heart slowed, her trembling eased, and she clung to the quiet strength of the man beside her. A group of neighbors approached hesitantly, their faces lit with admiration and gratitude. One older man with graying hair removed his cap, his hands trembling slightly as he spoke. "Marcus, and we all saw what they did to her. We all saw what you did for this neighborhood. We should have stood up long ago, but we were scared. You—" His voice cracked. "You weren't." Marcus didn't smile. He didn't need thanks or praise. His eyes softened, though, as he looked at the man. Fear only grows when you feed it. They counted on everyone staying silent. That's how bullies win, but not tonight. Tonight it ended. A ripple of nods and murmurs swept through the crowd. Mothers held their children tighter. Fathers exchanged looks of relief. Teenagers whispered excitedly, replaying every detail of the fight they had just witnessed. Some were already uploading the videos they had taken, the footage spreading across social media like wildfire. But Marcus paid no attention. His focus was solely on Lisa, who now let out a shaky laugh through her tears. "You always did have a way of making an entrance," she teased softly, trying to lighten the weight of the moment. He brushed his thumb gently across her cheek, careful of the tender skin. "And you always find ways to test my patience with fate," he replied, a hint of warmth creeping into his otherwise stern tone. As dusk settled, the neighbors slowly retreated into their homes, reassured by the quiet authority Marcus had brought back to the street. The Thompson home, once targeted, now stood as a symbol of resistance. The dented hood of Lisa's car, the bloodstains on the driveway, they were scars, yes, but they were also proof that their family had fought back and survived. Inside, Marcus guided Lisa to the couch, helping her settle with a fresh ice pack. The living room felt like a sanctuary now, the walls shielding them from the chaos outside. He sat beside her, his large frame hunched slightly, his hands clasped together as if holding back the storm that still raged inside him. Lisa studied him in the dim light, her eyes tracing the lines of his face. The weariness etched deep from years of service, the quiet pain of a man who had carried too many burdens alone. "You scared me today," she admitted quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not because of what they did, but because of how far I thought you might go." Marcus turned to her, his expression unreadable for a long moment. Then he exhaled, his shoulders loosening. "I went as far as I needed to," he said, his voice steady, his eyes holding hers. "No further. I promised myself a long time ago that I'd never bring the war home. But the second he touched you, the war came here on its own." Tears welled again in Lisa's eyes, but this time they weren't from pain. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his chest. His arms came around her instantly, wrapping her in the safety she craved. "I just need you here, Marcus," she whispered. "Not out there, not back then. Here." He kissed the top of her head, the gesture tender in contrast to the violence of earlier. "I'm not going anywhere. Not as long as I have breath in me." The days that followed were unlike anything the neighborhood had ever experienced. News crews descended, reporters knocking on doors eager to capture the story of the Navy SEAL, who had dismantled two violent imposters posing as HOA enforcers. Videos of the confrontation went viral, viewed millions of times within hours. The world seemed captivated by the story of a quiet suburban man who had unleashed his training in defense of his wife. But for Marcus, none of that mattered. He didn't care about the interviews, the praise, the endless commentary online. What mattered was Lisa's healing, the fading bruise on her cheek, the way her laughter slowly returned, the way she slept more soundly each night with his arms wrapped around her. The imposters, meanwhile, faced charges that multiplied with every revelation. Fraud, assault, impersonation of an officer, extortion. The list grew daily. Their faces, swollen and broken, were plastered across the news, their reputations destroyed. They sat in jail cells now, powerless, forgotten by the world they had once tried to control. One evening, as Marcus sat on the porch with a cup of coffee in hand, a group of neighbors gathered across the street. They spoke loudly enough for him to hear, their voices filled with admiration. "He saved us all," one woman said. "We were too afraid, but he wasn't." Another man added, "He's more than a neighbor, he's a protector." Marcus sipped his coffee, the corners of his mouth tightening into something almost like a smile, though he shook his head. Protector. Yes, that he could live with. Not a hero, not a savior, just a protector. Lisa stepped outside, slipping her hand into his. Her cheek had healed, the mark almost gone, but the memory remained. She looked at him with quiet pride. "You know they're right, don't you?" He glanced at her, one eyebrow raising. "About what?" "That you saved them. Not just me, everyone." Marcus considered her words for a long moment. Then he looked out at the street, at the children riding their bikes again without fear, at the families sitting on their porches with a newfound sense of peace. He nodded slowly. "Maybe, but all I cared about was saving you." The simplicity of his words, the truth in them, made her heart swell. She rested her head against his shoulder, their silence comfortable, their bond unshakable. Weeks passed, and the story eventually faded from the headlines. The neighborhood returned to its rhythm, though a deeper sense of unity remained. People greeted each other more warmly, watched out for one another more closely, and though the fear of imposters had been erased, the memory of the man who stood against them lingered. One night, as Marcus tucked Lisa into bed, she reached for his hand, holding it tightly. "Promise me something," she said softly. "Anything. If danger ever comes again, don't hold back. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like you need to apologize for protecting what's yours." Marcus stared at her for a long moment, the shadows of the room dancing across his face. Then he leaned down, kissing her gently. "I promise." And with that promise, the story found its end, not in violence, not in fear, but in love. A love so unshakable, so fierce, that it could break the faces of cowards and still remain tender enough to heal the wounds left behind. From that day forward, no one ever dared bring false authority, intimidation, or harm to that neighborhood again, because they knew the truth. Behind the quiet doors of the Thompson home lived a man who would rise when no one else could, who would stand unflinching against any storm, and who would do it all for the woman he loved. And that truth became legend, the story of the Navy SEAL husband who broke their faces and ended the reign of fear forever.